Good morning. It is April 30th, 2015. I am Nancy Becker at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University with Bill Waldman, former Director of the Division of Youth and Family Services and Commissioner of Human Services under 3 governors. We are here to continue our series of discussions on the Whitman administration for the Center on the American Governor. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Nancy.
Let's start by asking you to tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to college and graduate school?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, actually. I was born in Elizabeth, but my family moved to Newark. I grew up there, went to middle school, then the family moved to West Orange, New Jersey, in the suburbs later. And I had the opportunity to graduate from West Orange High School. Went to Penn State as an undergrad, ultimately came back to Rutgers University to get a master's degree in social work.
That's great. And tell us about your family.
Oh, I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren now. Of the grandchildren, I have 6 boys and 1 girl.
Wow. Let's talk about the beginning of your career. What was your first job out of college? And tell us, what you were doing.
Well, for a few months after graduation, I worked for my dad. My family had a business in Newark for about 40 years. And you know how it's difficult to work for one's parents. I had a friend who got a job as a welfare worker at the Essex County Welfare Board in Newark, and he said they were hiring. They paid the princely sum of $5,200 a year. I'll never forget that. It was actually very attractive to me at the time. And I figured I'd strike out on my own, at least for the summer, see what I liked. At the time, I was going in the evening for a graduate degree in English from Fairleigh Dickinson University, but was very much touched by what I saw as a caseworker in Newark that made a deep impression on me. You know, in the 60s, it was a time of social movements, and got very interested in civil rights and the Vietnam War issues, things of that nature. And I kind of drifted from English and really got bonded with the idea of doing social work and helping vulnerable families in Newark. Got an opportunity at the Welfare Board to get a scholarship and stipend to help get a graduate degree, and never looked back.
That's great. And I know that you then you worked for Middlesex County. How long between your first job and becoming the welfare director at Middlesex County?
Well, I was at Newark for a good 11, 12 years, I believe. I graduated up through a variety of positions, ran their food stamp program, welfare to work training, then went to Middlesex, became director of human services there, stayed another 12 years, enjoyed that very, very much. Built the department really from, it was a 1-person operation, human service idea were new, to ultimately incorporate most of the human services functions in government in Middlesex.
That's great. Now, how did that experience lead to your position with the state? And please describe that position and your responsibilities when you moved from Middlesex to state government.
Yeah, I became very active when I was in Middlesex and statewide human service affairs. I was invited to serve on a whole number of advisory committees. I got to know the then Commissioner Drew Waldman, who was really a wonderful individual and really inspirational leader, and became very interested in it and close to the action. And Drew asked me to join him to be what he called Assistant Commissioner for Community Relations, basically. Drew did not grow up in the human services in New Jersey and felt that someone with my background and roots could be helpful in marketing programs and services. So I made a difficult decision to move on from Middlesex, where I lived, where I was very comfortable, to go to state government.
So were you interested in politics then, or did you view these positions as policy positions, administrative positions, as you said, an opportunity to make a difference?
I saw them as the latter, the opportunity to make a difference. I was quite naive and unschooled in politics till much later in the career, and although I had seen my share of it in both Essex and Middlesex County, and became more sophisticated at the state level. But the idea of making a difference for so many people, particularly the department like Human Services that touched the lives of over 1 million citizens in New Jersey, my view was, as a social worker, that was a good way I could make a difference.
Bill, your experience in state government was interesting and unusual because you worked for 3 governors. From 1987 to 98, Governor Kane, a Republican, Governor Florio, a Democrat, and then Governor Whitman, a Republican. And as we were discussing before, you're a Democrat.
Yes.
So explain to us how that happened and what that experience was like.
It was really a wonderful experience. I remember when Governor Kane asked me to step up to be acting commissioner, I said to him in the interview, Governor, you know I'm a registered Democrat, don't you? Is that okay? And he put his arm around my shoulder. He said, not to worry about. That doesn't matter here. And it was the same in the Whitman administration. But my goal was to really make the department apolitical. And quite frankly, the three governors I worked for, their view of human services and their commitment to some of the most vulnerable citizens was not that different among administrations. So I felt very comfortable in all three administrations, so that the political connections didn't define me, really. I just tried to do the very best I could and be respectful to the views and leadership of the governors I worked for.
Tell us about your job, if you can describe your job, which is often called the most difficult job in state government.
It was extraordinarily challenging. It was never boring. There was always a crisis. Sometimes I felt I was careening from crisis to crisis. But there was also an opportunity to think strategically and to try to make a difference for the governor I worked for and the state that I adore, New Jersey.
Now, how did these governors differ in their approach and their view of human services?
It was very interesting. There's more similarities and differences in my view in many ways, but there was different styles of operating between the governors. Governor Kane, the first governor I worked for, permitted commissioners a great deal of latitude as long as you kept them informed. And when I worked for Governor, when we made the transition to work for Governor Florio, the point was made that we're a unified administration, we should speak with one voice. And I remember the governor looking at me and he said, Waldman, he said, I heard that in your department, even divisions take different positions on legislation. So you have to understand, we have to speak with one voice. So it was a little different, a little bit central control. I found Governor Kane very accessible. I remember meeting with him for the first time and being very anxious and telling him about the usual array of problems that human services was bringing. And I remember him comforting me. He's putting an arm around my shoulder, not to worry, encouraging me. It was very nice. Governor Florio, I didn't get quite as much access to, but I truly admired his deep commitment to policy issues. Governor Whitman I found extremely accessible, very, very supportive. Many times she would encourage me to call her during times of crisis. There were times that things happened that even made me think about resigning, and calling her and sharing all that angst I had, and her being very comforting, reassuring, but very committed to high principles of governance. So it was a pleasure. I admired all three, actually, but they had very different styles.
So describe your job, though, because I would like to have on the record the scope of what you were managing.
Very good, surely. Well, at that time, not unlike today, it was a truly umbrella-type department that housed a broad array of health and human services function. I was responsible for the Medicaid program in New Jersey, which today is about a $12 billion program, was about $7 billion then. All welfare programs in the state of New Jersey, we had to finance or oversee. All the state's psychiatric institutions and funding of a wide array of community mental health centers and developmental disabilities. Similarly, we had what were called developmental centers, a larger number then than now, and a wide group of contracts that we administered to various community-based organizations to serve people. We had about 20,000 employees at one time. I think that was a high watermark for size. But I also had child welfare, which of all the divisions, more so than they will break your heart. Because no matter how hard we tried, how much we invested in time and training, sometimes very sad things occurred and deaths of children and others that you would feel personally responsible for. When those kinds of things happen, when you're serving such vulnerable populations, you can't help but ask yourself, if I were a better commissioner, if I had led more strongly, if I had required more training, maybe that child would be alive or that family would still be together. It was hard. We also had juvenile justice for a while too, where now it's a separate commission of itself. So it had just an extraordinary array of governmental services that touch the lives of over 1 million citizens in the state. It was a heavy responsibility.
Yes. When did you meet Governor Whitman for the first time?
Oh, that's interesting. I may have met her when she was a freeholder in Somerset County, I believe. I think I might have met her at the New Jersey Association of Counties event. It's many, many years ago. And then, of course, got to work with her as governor. But I think it was while she was a freeholder in Somerset County.
When did she ask you to remain as Commissioner of Human Services?
Within the first couple months of her term, many of us stayed on as acting for a few months, and the governor had to make the decision of, what team she wanted to create and whether holdovers like me at the time would be on the team. She called me in and we had a conversation. She asked me to stay on. I was elated. I was sure I was going to have to find another job. Might not have the opportunity, but I was absolutely delighted when she asked.
Were you the only holdover in the administration? Were there others?
I think there were several others. There was Bill Fauver at that time, who had served many governors as Commissioner of Corrections, and there was this delightful gentleman by the name of Art Brown that was the Commissioner of Agriculture, who I think started the New Jersey Fresh program. I remember him because he would often bring to cabinet meetings some of New Jersey fresh produce, which was a treat.
He would bring it to the legislature as well.
He did as well, too, yes. And that was a lot of fun. I'm not sure there were others. There may have been.
Were you concerned about Governor Whitman's priorities in human services?
In what I know of her and following her views, not necessarily her priorities. I was initially concerned about her proposal to reduce the size of government and reduce taxation. I frankly was worried about the impact that would have on the human services. It turned out that they were generously supported during her administration.
Was there a change in policy, personnel, or administration from Florio to Whitman?
There was a turnover certainly in leadership and cabinet level positions, and my department was generally recognized that there were mostly professionals there. I was always worried because in government you have a number of what are called unclassified positions. And having lived through a number of governors, when the new governor comes in, there's always an assumption that those in those positions are political appointments. And in fairness, there was always several in my department, not many that were, but most were individuals that we got approval to hire that were really outstanding in their field, and we didn't seem to be able to locate the skills and competencies that they brought through the civil service system. So we had a few of those as well. And I was able to save some of those, which I was very proud of, and they continue to make contributions, and the people that were primarily political moved on.
Who did you work with in the governor's office on human service issues?
Oh, the array. Eileen McGinnis, Jane Kenney, Peter Venero, particularly. And I'm forgetting some names. Later, the governor's counsel, whose name I'm blocking at the moment. But,
John Farmer? No.
Yes, I did work with John. I worked with chief of staff of several of those. But what I liked about it was a good, strong team, and people I found to be accessible, people were to be reasonable. I did have issues with the Treasury Department, as I'm sure other cabinets did as well, too, because I was always advocating for more, and Treasury's role was to contain costs.
Right. There were some very significant achievements in human services policies during the Whitman administration. At our Center on the Governor's seminar on these issues, you called them Christie's greatest hits. Please tell us how you were successful in achieving, and I'm going to do it one by one and then spend as much time as you want, welfare reform, Medicaid reform, and kid care, and increasing options for the disabled. So let's take them, one at a time.
Sure. Let's start with welfare. Some may remember the times when President Clinton and the Congress passed really a draconian new law on a new form of welfare reform, and then it was the job of every state to adopt it and pass a state law to implement it in the way the state would want to do it. But basically the law required more personal responsibility, was focused more on work than on paying out cash, and had other very strong rules. So many states varied, but in New Jersey we had quite an episode, an interesting experience in government of crafting it. What I admired about Governor Whitman's approach to that was it was bipartisan, which is something that is unfortunately lost in today's environment. And at the time, because it was such an issue on the front burner of politics at the time, the legislators themselves were all introducing individual bills. And she said, we need to I need to get agreement with the legislators, stop with the individual bills, to create a bipartisan committee to work together and to craft something that's in the best interest of New Jersey. And she did. And I worked with that committee. It was bipartisan. It was, I remember, Wayne Bryan on the Democratic side, Joe Charles on the Democratic side, several other legislators on the Republican side. And we sat down and worked out together. Some wanted more work, some wanted more educational opportunities, some wanted more sanctions or penalties, some wanted the opposite of that. But we again reached a compromise that I think reflected New Jersey's values, the governor's values, and had universal support. It was kind of a tough love program. It stayed strong on personal responsibility, but it also provided opportunities for people such as child care payments, extended health care coverage for those that were willing to step up and get in the world of work. So I think we had, it was a wonderful process. I wish things got done like that today. And we did have some intense discussions.
And was there an educational component of that also?
Yes, there was.
And a transportation subsidy, if I recall correctly.
There was a transportation subsidy. The issue was some states chose not to pay for education or count it as work. We did. We permitted people to go on to college, for example. That was one of the agreements. We pay for transportation to work. One of the issues for people transitioning from welfare to work was they may have gotten a job, and it was usually not a high-end job in terms of salary, so many of the jobs people got did not pay for child care, for example, and did not have good medical benefits. So thinking comprehensively about how do we transition people to work so they get off welfare and stay off welfare, we figured they needed a bridge, a transition. So this governor, Governor Waldman, was comfortable extending child care for 2 years after people got off welfare and extending Medicaid or health insurance for 2 years. That was a huge hope. The other issue was very interesting that I think made ours very successful. And by the way, we reduced the welfare rolls to less than half.
That's what I was going to ask you, the impact.
And
wow.
we, at the time, the economy was booming, which was certainly a factor in our success. So many industries came to us and said, look, we need new workers, and by the way, don't train them too much because your training isn't that good. We'll train them. We just need people that can speak enough English to be like a sales representative, to learn enough about math to operate a terminal, and we'll take it from there. So we geared our programs that way. We partnered with industry, and we had a really good success rate, people moving off.
That's great. That's
It
great.
was exciting. It was a great opportunity.
Medicaid reform.
Oh, yes. Medicaid is still the largest program in state governments across this country. It's the same issue that we all face with health care. During Whitman's administration, she inherited a massive program. I would say it was out of control, and I take some responsibility for that in previous administrations because it had the rate of inflation and costs were double-digit. Many poor people got their primary care in emergency rooms in hospitals or in what I call Medicaid mills, private providers that would see and bill for hundreds, if not thousands of patients a day with substandard care, in my view. And we had to fix that. And the opportunity came to get a waiver from the federal government to convert what we had, which was a fee-for-service system where we paid a flat amount for each service, into a managed care system. So in doing that reform was very controversial. In fact, some of the HMOs at that time, health management or health maintenance organizations, managed care companies, didn't like the idea or didn't think that our recipients would fit into their program. So we had a tall task in front of us. We had about 400,000 lives covered by Medicaid that represented basically poor families that were on welfare and also got Medicaid. And the task was to enroll them in a market-smart way to Medicaid, in a way that they get a comprehensive amount of care that many of us were entitled to, but also at a controlled cost rate. So we did that. We created a market with 17 competitive HMOs and enrolled over 400,000 lives in a managed care program.
Wow.
We got enormous resistance on this. Many of the healthcare providers that were doing well with the Medicaid program wanted to be carved out, because in the old Medicaid program, you could use the political route to adjust rates. When we made it a market-based approach, then the marketplace and companies set the rates. So it was a very hard adjustment for many, a difficult fight, but it basically worked. And one of the things I'm proud of is that we got an award for the federal government recognition that rather than just putting in people in HMOs that we designated, we actually sat down with every family in the state and gave them the options of which ones and told them which ones would fit best with their family and gave them a choice. And we had the lowest rate of what's called default enrollments, where people were just shuttled into a standard program. And I guess the other thing I'm proud of with that, and the governor I know was proud of, is we did a survey of Medicaid recipients to see how they liked it. And it was amazing the response we got. They said many of them had the same kind of complaints we might have using managed care about prior authorizations. But basically they said, we're so glad we went to the system and we now have our own doc. We have our own doctor that knows our family, that cares for our family. We don't have to get a different doc in an emergency room at an area hospital every time. So I think we controlled costs through that reform, but importantly, we improved access and quality of care.
That's great. Kid Care, which is, an abbreviation for clearly a significant program.
Yes, it was. While during Governor Whitman's administration, the federal law passed that was in addition to the Social Security Act. It was Title 21. It was called Kid Care popularly, and we adapted it here in New Jersey. We called it New Jersey Kid Care. And what the federal government did through that program, they expanded the federal matching for Medicaid, basically, under that title, and created a program that you could use Medicaid or private company options for health insurance for low to middle income families. The Medicaid cutoff was extremely low. You just about had to be on welfare to qualify. But we knew at the time there were many middle-class working families that didn't have access to decent care. So there was options to the state about how far up in the low-income, middle-income, working-class families we could go. And we picked the highest amount. So New Jersey and just only a couple other states said that people should be eligible for this up to 350% of the federal poverty level. What was good is the governor insisted that we keep in a personal responsibility, so those above a certain level had to do co-pays and premiums and deductibles just like all of us do in healthcare. It was the idea of making a bridge from the poorest people who couldn't afford anything in a way to keep their health care all the way up to, and they got into work insurance.
That's great. And then increasing the options for the disabled, and there was a lot of deinstitutionalization, et cetera.
Yes, there was. Deinstitutionalization was a process that's been going on for many, many years, and it's always been very, very controversial. But rather than just follow an ideology, what we did with the governor's support and approval was to take a look at who's in our institutions, how they're used, how many we really need, and given today's technology and improved care, how many of those individuals currently residing in state institutions could be successful in the community with the right kinds of services and supports, and determining what services and supports there were. So we, like many states, had a very large stock of institutions that involved huge antiquated physical plants, some of them on 1,000 acres with literally scores of buildings. Some of them had cemeteries that they operated, as a matter of fact, and people lived and died there. So we took that look and we determined after a thorough strategic analysis with a lot of community input that we didn't need two of our major institutions in the state, and there was enough people residing in those institutions and others that we could place in the community with supports and thereby close down the plants. As much as that's accepted in policy today, even confirmed by a U.S. Supreme Court decision, it's still always very controversial for several reasons. One, clearly unions are not happy with this because it does eliminate a whole lot of union positions. Two, sometimes vendors and merchants in the area are usually very upset because we had well over 1,000 employees in each of those institutions. They created business opportunities for local. So some of the local municipal officials were often employees in our institutions as well too, particularly in the smaller towns. So it was a tough call, and
providing options for people to live in communities. I mean, placing those small residential facilities, that also created opposition.
It surely did. It surely did. I guess they used to call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. And many people said, yes, that's a good idea, but when we placed a group home or supported housing program next to people, it often caused quite an uproar. picketing, political pressure, all kinds of things happened across the state. One of the things I'm proud of is that the governor saw the righteousness, that's too strong a word, but that it was good policy. It gave people who were locked up in institutions, who were told when to get up every morning, what to eat every morning, what to do every day. It gave them an opportunity to fulfill their life potential. Not everyone, some people had to stay in institutions. So she was willing to spend the political capital, and a lot was spent on that. I remember once the governor brought me to a Republican caucus to explain it, and one of the state senators looked me in the eye and said, "Why the hell didn't you do this when you worked for a Democrat? Why do you have to do this now?" And the answer was that the governor has the political courage and is willing to spend the capital to do what I believe is the right thing.
Which is great. So you talked about talking to the Republican caucus. Did you work with the legislature on these issues?
Yes, we did. We presented them with a master plan that we had created about our future as to how many institutions would New Jersey need, plan to close the current ones as well. Had a lot of individual meetings to get the advice and participation of a variety of legislators. We were clear that we were determined to do something. One of the concerns which the governor creatively addressed, I thought, was the communities around Marlborough were probably most upset because it was a town of Ocean Grove, beautiful little town you may know, that unfortunately had at that time a disproportionate share of patients previously discharged from other efforts. And they felt that this was unacceptable, that we would dump all the residents out into Ocean Grove. I remember the mayor, I think it's Neptune Township, where Ocean Grove is part of, insisted I come to a meeting to speak to his town council about that. I said, look, as long as it's not a hanging party, I think I used those words, because tempers were really high. Well, it turned out I had a meeting, went from a meeting with the town council to an open meeting in the grand auditorium with several thousand people. I remember getting cursed at for about 2 or 3 hours. My integrity question, everything. But we did meet with a lot of legislators. We had public hearings. It was a very transparent effort, I believe. Didn't make everybody happy what they heard. It was very intense. But ultimately, with the governor's support, we went through it. And we then decided not to lose sight of this. What would be the impact on the patients themselves? And the deinstitutionalization, it was called, in the 60s and 70s, frankly, sometimes people were dumped out of institutions without community support, and bad things happened. They wound up in jails, homeless shelters, passing away from untreated medical conditions. So we committed to do a survey of the patients 6 months out to see where they were and to get their view. And it was almost universal that people felt they were in an equal or at least equal, in almost all cases, better arrangements. So it worked for them. The governor with Ocean Grove and Asbury Park made a compromise that I thought was very creative. They had a legitimate concern. They had, in Asbury Park in particular, they had some very substandard, large boarding type facilities that everybody knew were a disaster. So with the governor's support, we created other alternatives. We actually closed those, relocated every resident successfully to nearby good facilities, and dedicated the land to affordable housing. So that was a nice solution that the governor was willing to do to accommodate the concerns. And I know Ocean Grove is thriving now, and the people who have been discharged from Marlborough did very well.
That's great. Did you work with the legislature on your other major issues as well?
We did. There was always a bipartisan effort, and you know what? There was an ability to do so freely without political considerations, without getting lots of prior approvals to talk to someone from the opposite party. It was kind of an open process to bring them along. And I found that many of the legislators, when they heard the whole story of what generated this, that there wasn't political, it wasn't ideology, it was practical, it was in the best interest of the state and the million people we served, that we ultimately got some concurrence. I remember going to see Democrat as well as Republican legislators and laying it out for them.
And who did you work with? So it's interesting because you were certainly given a huge amount of freedom to work with legislators, et cetera. Who did you work with in the governor's office on the legislative strategy?
Whoever was director of the governor's council at the time.
Okay.
There was several of them. They were all very good. They were all very supportive. They were clear about limits, and they were very reasonable to work with.
How was the Whitman administration able to achieve enactment of these sometimes controversial issues? And you did begin to tell us that. But clearly this is, I mean, what you've described is not what is considered traditional Republican policy.
Right. I think it was Governor Whitman's own personal values and instincts that were amazing. Just one issue I remember about her. You know how controversial the issue is immigration today. We had an issue back then that was very controversial around welfare reform. The federal government said that if you're going to serve legal immigrants in these programs, meaning welfare and a variety of others, health care, you can do that, but you can't get any federal matching for that. So the states had to make a decision that if they wanted to continue to serve legal, not illegal immigrants, with the basic safety net services, they were going to have to pay for it with 100% state dollars. So that was clearly a governor's call as to what you're going to propose. So trying to be a good staffer, I tried to work up the numbers as to what it would cost, what some options were with covering some immigrants that were newer than others or here longer than others. So I had this, I laid out some options for her. And she stopped me in the middle of the presentation to her. And she said, Bill, when did your family come to this country? And I said, Governor, I believe my dad was first generation, actually. I'm only second generation. He came here when he was a little boy. She said, I think my forebears probably came on the Mayflower, we're not sure. But she says, weren't we all immigrants to this country at some time? Shouldn't we? Isn't that the promise of our nation? I was so impressed. I was so taken aback. So I could just throw away all the financial background about the other options. So yeah, I think it was the values and the principles that she stood on that I thought were very unusual, very progressive. She was fiscally conservative. I mean, she was responsible about funding with me in my department, and we came to a nice balance.
That's great. So, which is a good segue. So let's talk a little bit about Governor Whitman. What would, in your estimation, what were her greatest strengths?
She had a vision of the New Jersey that she wanted it to be. I think her greatest strength also was creating a team, so we all felt the sense of ownership of how well the entire administration did. Sometimes in other situations, in being in leadership groups and teams, there's this competition among staff or cabinet officers as who's better than who's done more than who's done what. And sometimes there's a great German word for them, I think it's Schadenfreude. Yeah, where sometimes we'd almost get glee if someone else was in trouble. There wasn't that there. There was really a team spirit that she built. I think the other strength was that she was willing to listen, be open to other opinions. And frankly, many times I clashed with the state treasurer about a variety of big programs, and she would have us both in, and we both make our case to her. And we had some intense discussions. And she would make a decision, and I respected that decision if it was in support of my view or not. But the idea was when we walked out, we were going to support that decision. But just the openness and access, her willing to hear, an open mind, being a good team leader and having a vision were, I think, some great strengths that she had. And her values, I would add her values.
What were her greatest weaknesses?
It's hard sometimes. They're hard to point out. They're really very hard to point out. Sometimes in politics, I think you have to be vindictive to make a point. I never saw that in her. To me, that's a strength. Maybe to politicians, that would be a weakness. Some say politics is the art of rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And I've worked in other governments where that wasn't, I won't mention them, that was an operating credo. But that wasn't about the governor. I think so I guess I could say sometimes strengths can be weaknesses in the political area. And that's, if she had any, they were in those.
Would you compare her to the other governors you worked with during your career?
Oh, it's hard to do. You know, I really, and I say this sincerely, deeply admired all of them. They're different individuals, they're different strengths, but in terms of their integrity, their leadership, their caring about the state of New Jersey, I really enjoyed them all. Christy will always have a special place in my heart because of her personal characteristics and my accessibility to her during her term.
From your perspective, how would you assess her administration as a whole?
I think it was, on balance, I think it was an overwhelming success over times. There were issues that in retrospect that a lot of us would have done differently, perhaps at the time, having more information about how things played out. But I think it was a great success, certainly from the purview of my department. I think we reformed entitlements in New Jersey. We reduced our reliance on huge state institutions that were backwards. We really reduced poverty during the governor's term, and we certainly spread the availability of affordable quality health care throughout the state. So from my perspective, working closely with other departments like health on initiatives, I think it was a very, very successful administration.
Her legacy certainly has not been given as much credence as certainly we've found in these interviews and the seminars that we've done.
Right, that's true.
You decided to leave state government before the end of the Whitman administration. Tell us why you made that decision and what you did then afterwards.
Sure. As we discussed at the outset of this discussion, it was a very intense job. And one of the things I've learned in my career is sometimes you get to the point where you've given the best you have to give, and it's time for someone else to step up with newer ideas, newer thoughts, newer energy. I was a little bit tired, to be honestly, still a relatively young person, but I got offered to be director of the American Public Human Services Association, which is the premier national organization representing state government officials and advocating human service policies at the national level. So it seemed like a logical career step at the time. It was a good time to move on. It was in the beginning of the second term that the governor had. And weighing all those considerations, I took a job in Washington, D.C. as head of that association.
Yeah, and Christy followed you before the end of her term. You have continued to have an interesting career since you served as Human Services. So following on service to the American Public Welfare Association, or I probably got that name wrong, tell us what else you've done since that time.
Well, in terms of direct employment, I came back to teach at Rutgers, which was an extraordinary opportunity for me because it gave me the opportunity to give back. That I had a career starting in 1965 as a welfare worker. It'll actually be 50 years this September. And I wanted to pass on the lessons I had learned, the experiences I had to people to give them those insights and strengthen their career. It was a very powerful draw. And even though I'm not what you call traditional academic, I don't do a lot of research or publication, I love the atmosphere, I adored students, and I found it a very fulfilling job. And at the same time, though, I got drawn into a lot of community activities. So I wound up, for example, today chairing the board of the Mental Health Association in New Jersey, the National Council of Alcoholism and Drug Dependence in New Jersey, and the Essex County Family Justice Center, which is a wonderful program about domestic violence to keep people, victims, safe and with the services they need, and lots of other organizations. People always tease me about how many community boards I'm on, but you know, the insights you get during the wonderful opportunities I've had to serve in government and the private sector are just, I feel that they're valuable and I can pass those lessons on. So I kept myself pretty busy.
Now, how long have you been at Rutgers teaching?
My goodness, I started here in 2001.
Wow.
At the beginning of the year. So it's, it's be 14, almost 15 years pretty soon.
Great.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about the Whitman administration that you would like to tell us that we may not have asked?
Oh, I think you've asked me a good array of questions about it. I think I've given you the flavor. There was some lightness that was fun. I remember an episode where the governor insisted we do a retreat as I don't know if you've heard this before, it was very funny, in a survival training type program.
I don't think anybody's ever told us about this, so it would be great.
So this is one designed to team building, actually. So we went to a big state park in Monmouth County, And we had all these exercises we had to do in small teams, which was actually to get people up in trees. It was really hilarious. I remember Bill Fawver, who's a large person, and I lifting up Deb Poritz to put her in the tree so she could look out at the rest of the group. You had to feel comfortable leaning backwards and falling with your team members behind you to catch you. It was things. It was a little bit physical, but it was just so much fun. I remember at one cabinet meeting, I was at the National Guard headquarters, and the head of the National Guard, the general, I believe it is, who heads it, was part of the cabinet. And they offered us an opportunity to, if anyone wanted to go for a ride in the F-16 fighter jet they had. So, all of us knew enough about that kind of ride to know there were G-forces, and it was challenging. So the governor, I think, was the only one, and maybe one other person to do it. And she was teasing us about being scaredy cats. It was just the lightness of humor and personality that really balanced out the rough edges that you have in this kind of work in government.
So thank you, Bill. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, Nancy. It's really been a pleasure. You brought back some wonderful memories.